Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, or condolences. Tonight, we're leaving behind the haunted castles and suspicious royal marriages, and drifting somewhere humbler, somewhere a little colder, muddier, and more fragrant. We're heading into the world of the medieval peasant. Specifically, what they did to keep their food from turning into something alive before they could eat it. Because back then, nothing stayed fresh for long. There were no refrigerators, no cling film, and the concept of best before was roughly translated as before the smell makes you gag. Still, peasants were clever. They had to be. And many of their strange little preservation methods actually worked, or worked well enough that they didn't starve. So let's drift through their kitchens, their smoky huts, their cold barns. Let's see how they managed to outwit bacteria, centuries before they knew what bacteria were. Salt, of course, was the great hero of the medieval kitchen. White gold, they called it, and it was traded like treasure. Peasants couldn't always afford much, but when they could get their hands on a lump of salt, it was used carefully, rubbed into meat, fish, even butter. Salt pulled moisture out, made things inhospitable to the creatures that caused rot. It also, incidentally, made everything taste like seawater. But when your other option is dysentery, you learn to be grateful. Fish was salted in great slabs, then hung from rafters or packed into barrels, dried so thoroughly it could break a knife. To eat it, you'd have to soak it for hours, sometimes days. There are accounts of peasants hammering fish to soften it, which sounds less like cooking and more like an act of desperation. But it worked. The fish lasted through the winter. Meat was a rarer luxury, but when slaughter time came in autumn, you had to make it last. So, people salted it, smoked it, or buried it in fat, literally encasing it in rendered animal fat to block out the air. This was called potting, or sealing. It was surprisingly effective. Months later, you could dig your hand into the fat and pull out something vaguely edible. It's not glamorous, but it's survival. And speaking of smoke, that was another secret. Peasants hung meats and cheeses in the rafters, above the hearth, where the smoke would waft through day and night. Over time, the smoke coated everything with a sticky, brownish layer that deterred flies and added flavor. A bit like living inside your own barbecue. In small cottages, everything smelled faintly of smoke. Your clothes, your hair, even your bread. It was the perfume of preservation. Now, fermentation. The quiet miracle of the medieval diet. Long before anyone used the word probiotic, peasants were cultivating their own living larders. Cabbage was chopped and pressed into barrels with salt, left to fizz gently into sauerkraut. Root vegetables could be buried in sand or stored in pits underground, where the temperature stayed steady. Even milk, the most perishable thing imaginable, could be turned into cheese or sour curds. Waste nothing, spoil nothing, that was the rule. And let's not forget ale. Brewing wasn't just recreation, it was preservation. Water was often unsafe to drink, full of delightful microscopic surprises. So peasants brewed weak ale, small bay, as it was called, that was safer, nourishing, and lasted longer than plain water. Everyone drank it, even children. There was no hangover, just mild hydration with a side of yeast. Fruit posed another problem. Fresh fruit barely existed outside harvest season, so peasants dried apples and pears on racks near the fire, or turned berries into syrups sealed with honey. Honey itself was a natural preservative, antibacterial, shelf-stable, endlessly useful. Beekeeping was an art, and honey wasn't just sweetener. It was medicine, sealant, glue, and emergency antiseptic. You could almost live off the stuff, if you didn't mind the stings. Pickling was popular too, though vinegar wasn't easy to come by. It was made by leaving wine or ale too long, basically an accident rewarded by usefulness. Everything from onions to fish might end up in a jar of vinegar, floating indefinitely, like some culinary time capsule. You might find an onion in there that predated your birth, still recognizably onion-like. A triumph, in its own way. In the North, they froze things, not in iceboxes, but literally outside. Winter was the best refrigerator there was. Food could be left in sealed barrels or wrapped in cloth and buried in snow. In early spring, you could dig it up again. If you were lucky, it was in a solid brick of something unidentifiable. If you weren't, well, that's what boiling was for. Dairy storage was another adventure. Butter could be salted or clarified into ghee, though peasants didn't call it that. Cheese was safer, milk preserved in edible form. Hard cheeses kept longest, soft cheeses were eaten quickly. Some households made cheeses so firm they were rumored to last for years. A gift to your grandchildren, perhaps, or a weapon, depending on density. Herbs and ash were also used, though less scientifically. Meat might be covered in ashes from the fire, to keep insects away. Some peasants rubbed herbs like sage or thyme into meat, believing they cooled the humors and kept rot at bay. Whether or not it worked, at least it made the meat smell nice while it decayed. And when all else failed, there was the pit method, burying your food. Sometimes in earth, sometimes in cool cellars, sometimes just under the floorboards. It wasn't elegant, but temperature underground was stable, and away from sunlight and air, food lasted a little longer. Some pits were lined with straw, some with clay. All of them, eventually, became exciting archaeological finds for people centuries later, who probably wished they hadn't opened them. Fermented beverages extended beyond ale. Peasants made mead, cider, and perry, whatever fruit they could find. They turned into something slightly alcoholic and much more durable. The line between drink and food was blurry. You didn't drink for fun. You drank because it didn't kill you. Anything extra was a happy side effect. Salted vegetables existed too. Early brines, primitive pickles. Peasants might salt turnips, leeks, even beans, sealing them in barrels for the winter. The salt brine drew out liquid and kept spoilage minimal. In a way, it was refrigeration by chemistry, though no one knew it. They just knew it worked. And storage itself was an art. Clay jars sealed with wax or fat. Wooden casks with leather lids. Linen sacks hung from beams to deter rats. Everything was a balance between keeping food close and keeping it out of reach of other hungry things. If the cats didn't get it, the weevils might. And if the weevils didn't, the mold certainly would. Meals in winter were often quiet affairs, nothing fresh, everything salted, smoked, or pickled. Bread was dense, soup was thin, and the smell of old cabbage hung in the air. Yet it kept them alive. The ingenuity of preservation was, in many ways, the difference between famine and survival, and there was a kind of comfort in it. Knowing you'd salted enough pork, dried enough peas, brewed enough ale. The slow rhythm of storing and saving marked the seasons, as much as harvest or snowfall. Every jar on a shelf meant another week of life. Every smoky beam above the fire was a small insurance policy against hunger. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're leaving the smoky kitchens and salted fish barrels behind, and drifting somewhere a little more perfumed, though not necessarily more pleasant. We're wandering into the tangled world of medieval marriage, adultery, and divorce. A world where vows were sacred, annulments were political, and infidelity was surprisingly creative. So, settle in. Get comfortable, because the medieval understanding of marriage was complicated. A blend of romance, religion, and real estate. For most of history, marriage wasn't about love. It was about property, alliances, and making sure your cows and your children ended up in the right hands. If affection appeared later, that was a pleasant accident. The church described marriage as a holy sacrament, binding souls forever. Feudal society saw it more as a contract, binding estates together, and between the two definitions, countless unhappy couples got stuck. At the core of it all was consent, at least in theory. The church taught that if both parties freely consented, a marriage was valid. It didn't matter if no priest was present, no family approved, or no witnesses existed. Two people could exchange vows privately, in a field, and be legally married. This caused predictable problems. Lovers eloping under the moonlight, only to regret it by morning. Parents discovering their daughters had married stable boys. Lawsuits, scandals, and bishops forced to decide whether whispered promises counted as lifelong bonds. Spoiler, they usually did. Royal marriages were their own brand of misery. Kings and queens weren't expected to love their spouses. They were expected to produce heirs, preferably male, and avoid international incidents in the process. Love affairs happened, but quietly, or less quietly, depending on the monarch's discretion. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine managed both passion and warfare. Edward II preferred the company of a man named Piers Gaveston, which didn't end well, and Philip IV of France the fair, spent much of his reign accusing his daughters-in-law of adultery. He wasn't wrong, technically, but it's hard to say who behaved worse, the lovers or the inquisitors. The concept of adultery, by the way, was lopsided. For men, it was frowned upon. For women, it was a crime. Wives caught cheating could be humiliated, imprisoned, or worse. Husbands caught cheating were advised to pray. The double standard was so consistent it became invisible, like the dampness in a medieval castle. In the countryside, marriage was more flexible. Peasants sometimes lived together for years before formalizing things. A hand-fasting ceremony, clasping hands and exchanging promises before witnesses, could be enough. The church tried to regulate it, but rural life had its own rhythms, and when a man or woman disappeared, remarriage could happen fast. After all, waiting 7 years to confirm someone was dead wasn't practical when winter was coming and you needed help with the plowing. Adultery took many forms. Some were emotional, some political, some almost bureaucratic. Noblewomen sometimes wrote letters to their lovers full of devotional language, love disguised as piety. Monks and nuns, despite their vows, occasionally found each other too interesting to resist. Entire monasteries were reprimanded for what the records delicately call improprieties. Others used coded confessions to reveal affairs, begging forgiveness from priests who were occasionally guilty of the same sins. The church had complicated feelings about all this. It condemned adultery but couldn't always prove it. It forbade divorce but allowed annulments, which, confusingly, meant declaring the marriage had never existed. Kings used this loophole often. If a bride came without a dowry, or if an heir failed to appear, suddenly someone remembered they were cousins, conveniently close cousins. Annulments could be granted for all sorts of reasons: coercion, consanguinity, meaning you were too closely related, impotence, or fraud. The famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine's first marriage to Louis VII ended on grounds of consanguinity, which was true enough, though everyone knew the real issue was that Louis was pious, awkward, and dull. Eleanor wanted adventure. She married Henry Plantagenet weeks later. History remembers her as scandalous. She probably thought of herself as efficient. For ordinary people, divorce wasn't an option. Separation might be possible if things turned violent, but remarriage wasn't allowed. Couples sometimes solved this by moving to another village and pretending to be single. Records show surprising numbers of widows whose husbands were still alive somewhere else. Bureaucracy moved slowly. Gossip moved faster. Even among royalty, the line between marriage and scandal was thin. Henry VIII's marital escapades are famous, but he wasn't unique, just more dramatic about it. Medieval Europe had plenty of quieter, equally awkward unions. Alfonso IX of Leon married his cousin Teresa, annulled it, married another cousin, and annulled that too. The result was a family tree that looked like someone had tried to fold it in half. Some couples, though, genuinely seemed to like each other. Letters between John of Gaunt and his mistress, and later wife, Catherine Swynford, suggest real affection. When they finally married, their children were legitimized by the Pope, proof that sometimes persistence paid off, or perhaps just good timing. For women, marriage was often a trap with gilded edges. A noblewoman brought dowry lands into her husband's control. A peasant wife brought labor. In either case, the husband ruled the household. But women found ways to assert influence, from managing estates, arranging matches, or quietly ensuring that children inherited more than they should. Behind many medieval kings stood a wife who kept the ledgers balanced and the alliances intact. Let's drift for a moment into the curious rituals of betrothal. Rings weren't always required. A belt, glove, or even a simple kiss could seal the deal. Sometimes contracts were signed years before the wedding, especially for royal children. A boy of 8 might be promised to a girl of 5, their future sealed in ink long before they could spell their own names. Occasionally, one of them died before marriage age, leaving a bureaucratic mess. Occasionally, both survived and hated each other for life. Dowries were another headache. They could make or break a union. A generous dowry could turn a minor knight into a landowner. A missing one could spark feuds. Entire wars started over unpaid dowries, a reminder that love was optional, but money wasn't. As for fidelity, it depended who was watching. Knights wrote poems to unattainable ladies. Queens flirted under the guise of courtly love. Affairs were tolerated so long as they didn't threaten dynasties. The problem came when children were born. because illegitimacy, while common, complicated inheritance, the church could forgive almost anything, except confusion over who owned what. And yet, through all this, the ideal of love survived. Troubadours sang of devotion, poets imagined perfect unions, and people, even peasants, dreamed of affection as more than duty. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it was remembered. So, medieval marriage wasn't all misery and manipulation. It was a patchwork of faith, necessity, and human frailty. Just like everything else in history, people wanted to belong, to be seen, to be loved. They just had fewer options, and much worse paperwork. Let's drift, then, from vows and betrayals to something gentler next time. Perhaps the world of medieval medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the flicker of candles in a cold stone chapel. Two nervous people whispering vows that might last forever, or at least until the next royal scandal.